Imagine what would happen if you took particular things from the world and abstracted away their contingencies, leaving you only with their essences. The essence of a particular feeling like love, hate, or despair, the essence of a particular situation like going on vacation, spectating a sports game, or spending time with your family during the holidays. Let us say you took those essences and incarnated them in another world, one separate from ours and physically inaccessible. However, you allow for a window, a kind of interface with which people from our world can view and experience this world of essences. Imagine what would happen if something like Plato's forms became manifest, viewable, experienceable, not just for the philosopher but for everyone. Chances are people would become absorbed in the splendor, the clearness, and the relatability of these essences, wanting to leave behind the real experiences from which they were derived. And what if they did? By taking the essences from their inaccessible realm as viewed through the interface and re-importing them into the real world, replacing through enactment piece by piece contingent reality with purest essence. What becomes of reality when it is replaced by pure essences, which express reality better than reality itself can? When new phenomena arise not from reality, but from the play of essences standing in for reality, and these phenomena become the foundation of a new real, what can we then say about the metaphysical ground of these phenomena? Are they still founded in reality, or in something else, something beyond reality? What has been introduced as a sort of thought experiment above is, perhaps unsurprisingly to some, something that we could say has already happened in the form of a subversion of reality through the media, whereby the images propagated via it assume the role of the aforementioned essences. Consider that, at this point in time, we cannot help but relate our own experiences in life to the myriad of images that we have seen on a screen, in video games, newspapers, or magazines, depicting these same experiences endowed with a level of detail and clarity that we fail to find in reality. A perfectly set up shot of a person in grief or an internalized impression of a kiss in a movie or video game may be said to reflect the essence of these situations better than similar situations experienced in real life. They are seen and related to by everyone around us and hence become a collective point of reference, and crucially, more often than not, these images even predate our own real experiences by a considerable amount of time. In other words, nowadays one has already seen images of the first kiss long before one has had the opportunity to relate it to one's own first kiss. As a result, the images become not just a collective, but also a first point of reference, and as such, in an ironic reversal, no longer simply depict reality, but engender it. Our behavior, our sensations, our objects, and our world. These images can be regarded as our own man-made and materialized versions of Plato's forms, expressing the true essence of things in today's world. As you might have already guessed, all of the thoughts I've just discussed are directly inspired by Baudrillard's philosophy. Interestingly, the thought experiment you just heard is never actually presented by him this clearly in his writings, but is more of an underlying theme that is threaded throughout his thinking. For example, the idea that images have come to precede our reality rather than the inverse is explored in more detail in his essay, The Precession of Simulacra. However, there he confines himself to bluntly giving examples of it, although the examples themselves are anything but blunt or easy to tie together. His thought processes and themes are in fact far more complex than a simple subversion of reality. He draws ideas from many different domains and weaves them together into something that is difficult to classify, starting out with sociology, his own discipline, traversing philosophy and going into science fiction and beyond. The centerpiece tying all of these ideas together, however, is his theory of simulacra and simulation, at least in Samuel Strehle's interpretation from his overview book Zur Aktualität von Baudrillard. I would concur. Besides, the simulation aspect has had the largest amount of cultural reception, partly thanks to Baudrillard's 3 provocative essays on the media coverage of the Gulf War. Therefore, In the following exposition, it is my goal to discuss some key intuitions regarding the theory of simulacra and simulation, as well as delve a little deeper into its theoretical backdrop. Let us start with the concept of simulation, and we will automatically develop an idea of simulacra in the process. One central aspect of simulation is surely this previously discussed re-importing of images back into our reality. The reason for why this happens, though, is explained by Baudrillard through the term of the hyperreal, which for him simply means more real than the real itself. An image or sign, Baudrillard uses these two terms almost interchangeably, can become hyperreal by depicting hyper-stylized aspects of reality. One example Baudrillard gives of this is found in his earliest published work, The System of Objects. It is that of a spoiler on a car, which, as a sign, signifies a dimension of speed that the car in its mechanical prowess cannot replicate. Here, it matters little whether the car can actually go fast or not, or may even be weighed down by the weight of the spoiler. The speed depicted by the spoiler is hyperreal, the sign more powerful than reality. Another, perhaps more relatable example would be food, as depicted in images inside restaurant menus, cookbooks, or food blogs. Somehow, the food one ends up cooking or being served always falls short of the level of crustiness and shine, let alone taste, that the images suggested it should have. It is via the re-import of these hyperreal images that we give rise to simulation, because at that stage our world no longer functions on the foundation of the real, but on the foundation of images derived from the real. As these images take over reality, new phenomena, new images will no longer bear any reference to the original reality, but only to other images. And it is exactly these new images and phenomena that Baudrillard calls simulacra. As such, any sign, any image, and anything can be a simulacrum on the precondition that it not be rooted in the real, but only in other signs and images. Let me give you an example. This one I found in the French edition of Welt im Kopf, in the chapter about Baudrillard. The authors discuss the Greek island Mykonos as seen in a photograph inside a travel magazine. First, they say one might wonder whether the picture is an adequate representation of the actual island or whether some unpleasant sights in the scenery have been artificially removed from it. This is the age-old problem of telling true from false. But now simulation begins and Mykonos becomes a simulacrum when, little by little, it starts to model itself after such photographs, which show a hyperreal depiction of itself. The incentive here is clear. In order to better fulfill tourist expectations, Mykonos will want to gain in whiteness and picturesqueness so as to keep up with the images. In the process, it ultimately ends up becoming more Greek than Greek. The question is, once such a convergence of image and reality is achieved, is it still possible to differentiate true from false? The answer to this question is a key aspect in Baudrillard's thinking, which is why, to better illustrate it, it will be worthwhile to consider a particular case study, a comparison between Plato's cave allegory and the 1999 movie The Matrix. It is, of course, clear to me that this is a comparison that is often made when talking about Baudrillard, and several other videos exist on the internet which discuss it at length. Nonetheless, I believe that any introduction to Baudrillard's ideas would be remiss to leave it out. The Matrix is interesting because it is the most iconic rendition of Baudrillard's ideas, which he himself rejected as an adequate interpretation. By analyzing the tensions between the two, we will get a better hold of the implications of simulation. First, let us briefly recap what The Matrix is actually about for those few who are unfamiliar with its plot. In the movie, the titular Matrix is a computer simulation which holds captive most of humanity, and the plot of the movie revolves around the protagonist Neo becoming aware of his imprisonment in the Matrix and ultimately breaking free of it. After his escape, Neo returns to the Matrix at certain times throughout the movie in order to stop the simulation and free the rest of humanity. Superficially, the movie wears its inspiration on its sleeve, to the point where a copy of Baudrillard's book, Simulacra and Simulation, as well as a quote from it, were integrated into one of the scenes. Further direct references to him and his work were at one point also planned to be included in it, and he was even asked to participate in the production of the sequels. Interestingly, though, he declined the offer and did not want his ideas to be associated with the movie, saying that it is the result of a gross misreading of his writings. In an interview with Le Nouvel Observateur, he commented that what he dislikes about the movie is the fact that the Matrix in it received a decidedly Platonic treatment. This statement is a reference to Plato's cave allegory, which is perhaps the most prominent philosophical writing dealing with illusions and truth. To get everybody up to speed, I will give a brief retelling of it before continuing. Plato's well-known allegory of the cave deals with the illusions of mankind and the philosopher's aim to transcend them through philosophizing, hopefully revealing the underlying truths of the world. The allegory involves imagining a group of people who have spent their entire lives chained by their feet and neck inside a cave. The chains prevent them from turning around, allowing a view of only one of the cave walls. On that cave wall, all they ever get to see are the shadows cast by objects that are being carried past behind their backs, without them ever being able to catch a glimpse of the real objects themselves. Now, the philosopher, or so the allegory goes, is a prisoner who wants to escape the world of shadows by escaping from the cave and seeing reality for what it truly is. While ordinary people are prisoners who do not share that wish, never knowing that their world is but an illusion of something more real. The difference between the cave allegory and Baudrillard's simulation is that, in Plato's account, there is an actual outside world, a real world that is decidedly not one of illusion and which one can reach if one knows how. In simulation, on the other hand, there is no longer a way to distinguish what is simulated from what is real, precisely because the hyperreal and the real have become one. The images are now the real against which they themselves are measured. To map this onto Plato's cave, it is as if, upon breaking free of the shackles and turning around, one realizes that the object casting the shadow on the wall is just another shadow. This is not to say that all of reality definitively has become simulated, but that one can never know for sure what is part of the simulation and what isn't. At all times, one has to uselessly wonder, is this real or is it a simulacrum? Now we can understand why Baudrillard rejected working on the Matrix sequels and did not want his writings associated with any of the movies, namely for the fact that in the first movie, the Matrix is always easily distinguishable from the real world. Despite Neo's changing between the Matrix and the real world several times, he never once questions his whereabouts and never expresses any sort of ambiguity. Baudrillard has been criticized by some due to the fact that the later Matrix movies hint at a dissolution of the clear-cut nature of Matrix and reality. Nonetheless, Baudrillard's assessment of the Platonicity of the first movie appears to be accurate. At this point, there is one question looming on the horizon. How is it that we originally came to inhabit a simulated world? Looking again at the Matrix, there the answer is seemingly simple. The cause for humanity's imprisonment in the Matrix are intelligent machines, which require the bioelectricity produced by humans to survive. While this is no doubt a symbolically fitting depiction of Baudrillard's own provocative ideas regarding the sovereignty of the object over the subject, it implies the existence of an external agent, the machines, and a precise point in time at which the Matrix was first turned on. Something similar is hardly imaginable in the real world unless we are truly talking about an actual computer simulation. Instead, it would make more sense to see the true process as historical and continuous. Even though Baudrillard does not give a very detailed answer to this particular question, he does sketch a historical development of science, describing how they first became detached from the real and finally gave rise to simulation. In order to be better able to understand and appreciate the evocative nature of Baudrillard's description, it will be of help to look at the theoretical foundations of his concept of signs and images, which, all things considered, is rather simple. His theory combines structural linguistics with Marxist theory. Specifically, he takes the concept of linguistic value from one of the fathers of structuralism, Ferdinand de Saussure, and combines it, or rather equates it, with Karl Marx's theory on use value and exchange value. This might sound complicated, but bear with me here. Saussure thought that a linguistic term is articulated in two dimensions. Just like a piece of currency can be exchanged for A, an object that can be bought with it, and B, it can be put into relation with all the other pieces of currency, the linguistic term can be exchanged for A, its designated, which is a particular object in the world like an apple or love, and B, it stands in some sort of relationship with other linguistic terms in the same linguistic system. You can think of this last notion as an explanation for how words acquire their meaning. For instance, the word cat denotes the animal cat only by virtue of the existence of all the other words like dog, cow, mouse, animal, and so on, which denote their respective concept. According to Saussure's theory, it is only in opposition to these other words that the word cat receives its meaning. And if it didn't exist, the concept cat would be subsumed under a neighboring term for a lack of differentiation. A similar structuralist hypothesis has made its way into the domain of cultural color perception, or in other words, how linguistic communities assign meaning to their color terms. The Berlin K hypothesis states that when there are only 3 terms for colors in a language, there is generally one for dark colors, one for bright colors, and one for red. Now, if you reduce the number of color terms by 1, and indeed there are languages with only 2 concepts for colors, the color red counts towards the bright colors. In other words, linguistic terms here acquire their meaning only in opposition to the other terms. Without the term red, the color red is simply a bright color, for lack of its opposition with other colors. This is the structural dimension of the linguistic term, and Saussure reserved the name linguistic value for that particular value that a term receives in the structure. Although linguistic value sounds important, according to Saussure, the finality or ultimate purpose of the linguistic term does not reside in its value, but its exchangeability with the object that it designates. Again, similar to how money is grounded not in its infinite exchangeability, but in the purpose of allowing one to acquire things with it. Baudrillard finds similarities to Saussure in Marx's conception of use value and exchange value. For Marx, a product had a use value which relates it directly to the affordances it provides, and an exchange value which it obtains upon entering into market relations with other products. Here, the use value is similar to the designated object in the case of terms, while the exchange value can be likened to their previously discussed structural dimension. In fact, in his own theory, Baudrillard supposes that Saussure's notion regarding linguistic signs and Marx's notion regarding products are actually the same fundamental system, but articulated in different contexts. Therefore, Baudrillard generalizes them and turns terms and products into simple signs and images, which he conceives as having a designated real against which they can be exchanged, and as standing in some sort of structural relationship with other signs and images. Ironically, as soon as he establishes this framework, he dismisses it with regards to our world today, arguing that the original finality of the sign, its designated, has been lost to the ages, and that all that remains today is the structural dimension of the sign. In reference to Saussure's concept of linguistic value, Baudrillard defines the value a sign assumes in the structure as the sign value. And this event of signs becoming detached from the designated real is what he calls the structural revolution of value. One way to understand the significance of the sign value in our society is to look at brands, because they distinguish themselves from their competitors first and foremost through a label or logo. This logo is a sign which gives way to a network of other signs constructed in large parts through advertising. Advertisements employ images to build up that web of opposition and differentiation that the brand requires to gain attention. Like in language, where the proper interpretation of a word requires knowledge of the language as a whole, interpreting a particular brand's sign value also requires literacy of the structure as a whole. Unlike words and language, though, the brand is entirely disconnected from the real. It is entirely sustained by the structure of images and never exchanged for anything more substantial. Since signs are no longer weighed down by that heavy obligation according to which they have to be exchanged for a designated real, they are now free to exchange themselves with other signs without restraint, and the sign value becomes the prominent mode of valuation. For Baudrillard, this signifies the emancipation of the sign, liberating it from the real and allowing concepts to become fully exchangeable, or as he calls it, commutable. He says, commutability of the beautiful and the ugly in fashion, of the right and the left in politics, of the true and the false in the media, of the useful and the unuseful at the level of objects, of nature and culture on all levels of signification. With this preliminary knowledge in hand, we can now return to our earlier question of how this becoming weightless of signs and images developed historically. Its beginning is traced back by Baudrillard to the Renaissance era, during which bourgeoisie values were spreading throughout society. And as they spread, the old class-based societies were subsumed under just one unifying value system. Prior to this, each class, like artisans or scholars, was equipped with its own value system. Under bourgeoisie values, however, suddenly everyone was participating in the pursuit of the same values, and with this imposition of unification, ultimately the understanding of signs changed. Specifically, Baudrillard argues that this change brought with it the introduction of the counterfeit sign, which he opposes to the older original sign. An original for Baudrillard is a unique sign carrying a true obligation, as he calls it, such as, for example, a particular gown carrying the obligation of representing the social caste of the wearer. In this sense, the gown is a symbol of that particular social caste, and the social caste is the designated real for which the gown as a sign is exchanged. Making copies of that gown and distributing them to people from other social castes would be insignificant, in the sense that the gown does not turn whomever wears it into a member of that social caste. Instead, illegitimate copies still had to measure themselves to the original, revealing themselves as an evil representation in the end. Evil in the sense that they went against the natural order. Once the value systems unique to specific social castes had been replaced by the all-subsumptive bourgeoisie value system, original signs were pushed aside and opened a space for what Baudrillard calls the counterfeit. The counterfeit is a sign which dreams of being an original, but ultimately lacks that necessary obligation. For example, wearing fake embroidery on clothing became a worthwhile endeavor under bourgeoisie values because it was no longer grounded in a real social obligation. Since anyone could accede to bourgeoisie values, imitation through counterfeits became the rule, and true representation was made irrelevant. It is these counterfeit signs that Baudrillard considers the first order of simulacra, as they are the first step towards detaching signs from their designated counterpart in reality. Whereas in the first order of simulacra, the original lived on as a remembrance in the counterfeit, the second order does away with it altogether. It refurbishes signs to no longer come as a pair of original and counterfeit, but rather as an infinite series, the infinite series of industrial products. With the Industrial Revolution, the distinction between original and counterfeit became obsolete, as the individual instances of a series had simply become equivalent in their status. Baudrillard asserts that we could not have had an ideology of mass production without a radical reframing of signs, in the wake of which the original sign is forgotten about, namely because there is no purpose to producing originals. The second order of simulacra is probably the one that is least discussed by Baudrillard, as it presents but the intermediary step between the more interesting first and third orders. According to him, it was always only an ephemeral stage. After the Industrial Revolution, it is the third and final order of simulacra that coincides with our current age, or at least with the time of Baudrillard's writings. As with the other orders, Baudrillard is vague in describing the turning point from the second to the third, but generally speaking, he sees the third order as really picking up speed after the Second World War. Third order simulacra are described by Baudrillard as genetic models, which one can imagine as an absorption and collapse of the second order infinite series. In contrast to the infinite series, these simulacra are conceived as reproducible from the outset, and their various incarnations will be generated according to specific modulations, imbuing the incarnations with distinct oppositions rather than upholding the equivalences of the series. These oppositions should remind us of what we said previously about the structural dimension of linguistic terms, which also operated by way of oppositions. For Saussure, the structural relationships between words amounted to something like a code, and something similar applies to Baudrillard as well, who, in these modulated incarnations, sees the emergence of something like a binary code, a binary structure whereby each difference between incarnated forms is retraceable to distinct changes from one value to the other. This idea of distinct oppositions alludes back to the structural revolution of value, and in fact, he uses the term code quite frequently to describe the laws that govern the structural relationships between signs in this third order. Baudrillard has been criticized for his failure to properly define his concept of the code, with critics saying that it could be applied to almost any culture and any time period. After all, codes of conduct and codes of signification arguably exist in all cultures. This line of reasoning, however, fails to take into account the loss of the real, which Baudrillard wants to emphasize. In indigenous cultures, surely one can identify a code of conduct, but in Baudrillard's eyes, that code would still be connected to the real. There it is not primarily the structural dimension of signs and their sign value which have a monopoly on valuation. Another response to such criticisms, one which points at a different dimension of Baudrillard's code, comes from Samuel Strehle, the author of the book I mentioned earlier. He points to Baudrillard's frequent association of the code with the then popular science of cybernetics, a discipline which was extremely information-centric. In it, the world is viewed as a system of interconnected subsystems, with an emphasis on the informational pathways between them, which, in their completed form, would spell out something like the code of the whole world. The issue Baudrillard takes with this conception is that it reduces the world to operationality. To illustrate this somewhat abstract idea, let us look at how Baudrillard discusses the discovery of DNA, which he goes so far as to call the prophet of the code. For him, DNA is the quite literal manifestation of such a cybernetic code, as it reduces the genesis of all life down to a code, making it possible to boil life down to the terminology of information exchange. At this point, one might rightly ask, okay, what does it matter whether we see the origin of life in terms of a code and is functional? One could say that it is obviously a clear instance of scientific progress, after all. According to my own analysis, there are two paths that the debate may take at this point. One of them is about scientific progress, truth, and so on, while the second one is about the societal, cultural, and psychological effects resulting from a belief in DNA as the genetic code. In terms of the first path, you can say that Baudrillard is clearly a Nietzschean and thus denounces the possibility of an objectively real world. One's alignment with this metaphysical conviction does not, however, bear much import on the less metaphysical second path. Here we rather ask, what happens when the belief spreads that DNA, or any code for that matter, is the locus of life? This, I think, is the less contentious path, and therefore, regardless of your own metaphysical convictions, the following considerations should not be dismissed on those grounds alone. Baudrillard points out that life's purpose, or telos, used to be viewed as located in a higher power of some kind. Under the reign of a code, as the genesis of life, however, life's purpose moves inwards and becomes inscribed into the code from the very beginning. This means that the code's proliferation becomes its own finality. We can see what this amounts to when we consider that, in this view, life's purpose can be construed as nothing but the proliferation of DNA. What follows from this is that it is difficult to conceive of something outside of life against which life can be exchanged. The idea of self-sacrifice, for example, becomes rather unthinkable. Extrapolating this idea, one might say that any code will attempt to reproduce itself indefinitely for its own sake, while not really serving any purpose outside of itself, just like the images and signs which no longer serve to be exchanged for a concrete designated real. In fact, Baudrillard finds such self-centered, self-serving, and ultimately hollow simulacra all throughout society. Generally speaking, what he observes is that there is a trend towards valuing things for their pure operationality, or their capacity to be integrated into and function within a larger system. Think, for example, of products promising seamless integration to one's daily routine, work routine, or even larger systems, as in the case of eco-friendly products. The now so popular term work-life balance, which I'm not even sure if anyone actually talks about unironically, is a prime example. Differentiation and ideal synthesis of two distinct functional systems into a larger functioning whole. The entire idea apparently driven by companies whose only aim is to achieve better economic stability. I will now discuss in more detail two of the third-order simulacra that Baudrillard devotes a lot of attention to. The first of them is the body, and the second is production. Baudrillard sees in the body an operationalized medium through which other signs express themselves, in the form of fashion, for example. Even the naked body is but the medium of signs, chief among them sexuality. Sexuality for him, far from being grounded in reality, is also purely structurally construed through, and I quote, physiological equilibrium, part of a general hygiene, mental equilibrium, expression of subjectivity, emanation of the unconscious, and the ethic of sexual pleasure. At the risk of straying a little from the three-order framework that's been established, I would like to remark that in later years, Baudrillard believed to observe that the operationalization of the body has even left behind all manners of signification, even the structural kind. For him, this apotheosis of operationalization is achieved in the act of jogging, where these days, ideally, one forgets entirely that one is running at all, hoping to simply function one's way through the jog. No longer looking to signify anything at all, the body is now merely a signal, one which, by the sole virtue of its existence, demands to be turned on. He says, no longer governed by an individual will gauging the effort expended with a view to self-transcendence, it, the body, is controlled by an internal microcomputer working by calculation alone. He makes similar observations about the act of sex, which, no doubt under the influence of pornography, has been increasingly reduced to mere performance. In contrast to the operationality of the body, Baudrillard brings up a Native American who once expressed that for him, his entire body is his face. Baudrillard interprets this to mean that the Native American's body is grounded immediately in a game of symbols that exists beyond mere structural value or operationality. In other words, it is still connected to reality. The second simulacrum discussed by Baudrillard is production, as in the socio-economic ideology of material production, which we have already encountered during our discussion of the second-order simulacra. Where production once operated under the idea of liberating hidden potential, fulfilling the needs of the people, however arbitrary, and producing some form of surplus value, Baudrillard argues that today production has left that pretense behind. Nowadays, production does not care anymore whether what is produced fulfills needs or yields anything in surplus. All production cares about is whether the process of producing can be reproduced. Thus, the more fitting term, he argues, would be reproduction. To illustrate what he means by this, we can take a look at the circular nature of our habits of consumption. I don't think it is far-fetched to say that whatever surplus value has been derived in production is immediately negated since products are designed to break or are rendered obsolete by the next generation of the same product line. Furthermore, new desires are being created all the time through images, and their only purpose resides in the fulfillment of that artificial need. Plus, they are oftentimes designed to automatically generate new needs. Baudrillard says that to speak of a surplus value in this process is entirely misguided. It is rather a hollow cycle whose only aim is to continue to exist and proliferate. He adds to this that even our conception of labor is part of it. It used to be the case that labor had a transcendental quality to it, but not anymore. Labor has become more of an incessant reallocation and reproduction of labor, which eternally generates and consumes itself. Even from the point of view of the consumer, we can see a similar picture emerge. Despite many people knowing that their needs are manufactured, they keep fulfilling them. It is as if their habits of consumption are taking place outside of themselves and their own reasoning. What else is there to do but consume for consumption's sake? Not to fill some arbitrary desire, but because that is how the system works. Production for the sake of production, not to produce anything of importance, but to keep the system on track, looping around. Ultimately, and this is Baudrillard's point, production now follows its own internal logic, and, like the code, has an internalized finality which is entirely disconnected from any purpose outside of the play of signs that keep it afloat. Over the course of the video, we have encountered the idea that our reality today may actually have emerged from hyperreal images simulating reality. We have also seen that, under this premise, the distinction between true and false might have disappeared, something which no doubt many of us are quite familiar with given the prevalence of so-called fake news. But fake news are only a superficial symptom of this change. According to Baudrillard, even the sciences and even philosophy itself suffer from the floating of all concepts, allowing for their infinite exchangeability. Despite my introduction of Baudrillard's simulations at the beginning of the video via the intuition of mediatized images, it should have become clear that this is far from an exhaustive description of the phenomenon. It was useful, however, for an initial familiarization with the subject matter. Later on, we saw that there are more varied sides to simulation, with talk of counterfeits, originals, series, genetic models, and codes. Reading Baudrillard, one will discover a veritable host of ideas that connect with and expand on this basic framework in unsuspecting ways. One of them would be the more or less key concept of symbolic exchange, to which Baudrillard dedicated his main work, Symbolic Exchange and Death. Even though that book served as a major source for this here video, I was sadly unable to discuss the topic mentioned in its title in any detail, largely due to the fact that knowledge of simulation is somewhat of a preliminary for doing it justice. Really, my goal with this video was to give a small glimpse of the larger picture that Baudrillard develops throughout his writings. Like a lot of his French contemporaries, he wields an extremely associative style of writing, something which will most certainly not appeal to a lot of analytically minded people at first glance. In response to opinions that denounce his writing style as mere jibber-jabber, I have to say that it simply takes time to come to grips with the multi-layered points he often makes. It can require some research and active interpretation on the part of the reader as well, and one should not expect to have anything spelled out in the form of definitions or logical connections of arguments. Some have described his writings as closer to science fiction than to philosophy or sociology, and perhaps this is right, especially if one considers that his ideas have a prophetic character to them, prefiguring developments that are only now becoming visible to us. Although I think that if one wants to do him and his philosophy justice, one has to evaluate his thought from a point of view that incorporates his own intentions. Baudrillard wanted theory active and involved in the world it is describing. Perhaps not unlike Marx, he wanted to change the world through his philosophy, although on a slightly different level and with another strategy. In the chapter Why Theory, from The Ecstasy of Communication, he writes, "To be the reflection of the real, to enter into a relation of critical negativity with the real, cannot be theory's end. It is not enough for a theory to describe and analyze, it must itself be an event in the universe it describes. It must tear itself from all reference and take pride only in the future. Theory must operate on time at the cost of a deliberate distortion of present reality. In other words, in order to describe a simulated world, theory itself has to become a simulation."